Chapter 10. The Key to the Door. She whisked out of Boontown, as she had whisked into it, the bays sweeping the light rig along at a terrific clip. Presently she turned onto a dim country road, made by the wear of travel, but never graded. Straight out of it she drove until she came to a sight of the house of the Zellers. She drew back her horses to a slower gait and finally pulled up behind the house. Instantly her eye met a reminder of the crime. Two parts of a door, split cleanly down the center, were leaning against the wall near the kitchen window. This was the door that both young Zeller and Jack Montaigne claimed to have broken through, in an effort to get at the room of the dead man. She tied off her horses and, turning away, found Mrs. Zeller, in the act of wiping a milk tin, standing at the door of the house. The big, ugly face of the woman stirred a reluctant smile of welcome. "Mary Larrabee," she exclaimed. "How long since you come this way?" "Pretty nigh on to 3 years, I guess. I've heard so much about this murder," said Mary, as she shook hands, "that I wanted to see the place." "May I, Mrs. Zeller?" "A terrible thing," replied Mrs. Zeller. "The shock it give me. I ain't over yet. Gus was hit pretty hard, too. You want to see the room? If you please. Come right up." She started to lead the way. "A terrible thing," she repeated. "And me and Gus sure was fond of old Mr. Benton. I know some folks didn't like him much. He had his ways, but all old folks do. We were used to him and knew how to make allowances. Yes, we were fond of old Benton. There's an empty feeling around the house, now he's gone." Mary Larrabee shivered with disgust. One glimpse of Benton's face would be sure warrant that no human being could ever find a spark of affection to waste on the old fellow. They stood at the door of the room. "There's the place," said the woman. "There's where he laid, with his head turned a little to one side. Do you see the mark? Soap and hot water, nothing does any good to take that stain out. I've worked till my arms ached, and still it won't come out. Poor Mr. Benton. I hope they hang that Jack as high as the moon." "You really think he did it?" "Think? Child alive, don't I know? Didn't I hear him talk? Didn't I see the way he looked, when he heard that the poor old man had money in his room? Right then I says to Gus, 'There's no good in this man, Gus, there's no good in him.' And it sure turned out that there wasn't any." "Well," replied Mary Larrabee solemnly, "may the guilty man hang." She turned away, sick from what she had seen, and went slowly down the stairs. Down those stairs Jack had fled, according to his story. Up those stairs old Benton had dragged himself for the last time, on that terrible night. Every detail of that night of storm and horror came back to her. In the open air she drew a great breath of relief, and, approaching the broken door, she drew out the key, that she had picked up beside the jail, and tried it hastily. The lock turned smoothly under the pressure and turned back again. Mary Larrabee drew it forth and dropped the key back into her pocket, her heart racing with excitement. "How come?" asked Mrs. Zeller, following with aggressive curiosity. "I forgot to say," said the girl glibly enough, that my father asked me to bring back the lock of the door to Benton's room. Will you let me saw it out? Mrs. Zeller fixed her big, startling eyes upon the face of Mary Larrabee, frowning. Evidently she was not at all pleased. It don't sound like your father, sending you around on jobs like this, she declared. It don't sound the least bit like him. He knew I was coming out here, anyway, explained Mary. Said Mrs. Zeller gloomily. You want the lock, but why do you want it? I never could make any sense out of these legal matters, said Mary, managing to smile in the face of that dark suspicion, but that's what Dad asked me to bring. Of course, if you don't want to part with it, I'll simply go back and have him. It ain't that, protested Mrs. Zeller, but it'd be more regular, if the sheriff was to send out a written order for it, or a request for it, being that he wants it for evidence. I suppose it would, said the girl, but I've already done what he told me to, by asking you for it. She made as if to turn away, but Mrs. Zeller, in a quandary, called her back. I don't want to hinder the law none, she said. If this'll help to hang Jack, why, take it and welcome to it. I'm sure I ain't got any purpose in keeping things back. I ain't got anything to hide from your father, or any other sheriff. Of course not, said Mary. Then I'll take the lock back, if you'll let me have a saw. Mrs. Zeller was gone a long time in the house, apparently hunting for the saw, but Mary heard the voice of mother and son in heated argument. At length, Mrs. Zeller came out with the saw and, gloomier than ever, proceeded to cut out the lock and hand it to Mary. I hope it brings bad luck to Jack, whatever's his name. I hope this lock is the thing that hangs him, she said savagely. Mary untethered the horse and climbed back into her buggy. Why do you hate Jack so much? She asked, when she had turned the buggy around. Why? Because he's a crook, said Mrs. Zeller fiercely. And because he done a murder under my roof and robbed me. Robbed you? Asked Mary Larrabee. Sure he did. Wouldn't Mr. Benton, if he'd died natural, have left me something in his will? Of course, he would have. Who robbed me of it, then? Why, this Jack, this devil did. Ain't that clear as day? Mary shook her head. I don't know, she said, but, if Jack is a murderer, I don't know where we can find men we can trust. Wait a minute, said Mrs. Zeller suddenly, starting for the heads of the horses. Wait a minute. Hold on, Mary Larrabee. I've changed my mind about. But a sharp cut of the buggy whip sent the bays sprinting away. I can't wait, called Mary in explanation. I have to hurry back. Then she dashed past the big woman and out onto the road. Mrs. Zeller followed a step or two, then paused with her arms akimbo, and stared after the flying little equipage. At length, she turned sullenly back toward the house. There's a devil in these young girls, she confided to her son a little later. And I'd give a lot to know what she's up to, the little vixen. The first thing that Mary did could have been seen from the house. She halted her team beside the tree, where the tramp was known to have kept his fire on that night of nights. The site of the fire she examined carefully and then swung the team back onto the road. The bays were in a foam, when she brought them back into Boontown and drew up before the carpenter's shop. She found the proprietor in the very act of starting for the country. "Old Mrs. Purvis just phoned in," he said. "If your dad has some business for me, Mary, I guess it'll have to wait. Mrs. Purvis is plumb rushed. That's the way it goes with old folks. They want everything done so fast you'd think they was afraid death would come along before it was done. But Mr. Hans," said the girl, "this is a matter of life and death." Said the carpenter, and pulled his glasses down on his nose, so that he could peer at her over them. "Life and death." She placed the lock on the workbench. "Is that a common lock, Mr. Hans?" He examined it, took up a bundle of keys, and tried some, one by one. Presently the lock was turned under his manipulation. "Common enough lock, all right," he said. "I got 20 old keys, right here, that could turn it." Mary Larrabee uttered an exclamation of despair. "But," she protested, "I want to prove that this key belongs to that lock. And now you've spoiled everything for me." She drew forth the key and handed it to him. "Lemme see," muttered the carpenter, who was locksmith as well. "Lemme see, now. Maybe it does belong, but what difference does that make? I can fix you up with other keys for it." "Other keys?" "No, no. Mr. Hans, you must prove that this key belongs to this lock." "Well, maybe I could. You see where the bit of this key is worn off a little? That comes from being used in a lock that has a rough place in it. I can find out in a minute." He set to work with a screwdriver, taking the lock apart, examined it carefully, and then straightened with a grunt of satisfaction. "Look for yourself," he said. "Don't need no microscope for this. See this place, sticking out in the lock? That's what's worn away the key. Must have took a tolerable lot of use to do it, but there ain't any doubt. See how it fits into the worn place." "Mr. Hans," asked the girl, "how can I thank you for showing me?" "You've saved him." "Saved who?" But lock and key were snatched from the carpenter's hand, and she was gone, whirling through the door.